everyone. My name is Moses Sampal, part of Quantum Computing India. The community we are trying to build is around tech, science, policy, and art around quantum within India. Now, why this becomes important is because learning the technology aspect of this, of course, becomes important. But as we all know, for us to really leverage the power of the quantum computing per se, we have to understand the uh, basic physics behind it, the basics of quantum physics behind it, and a lot more science. Unlike trying to build an IoT solution or a blockchain solution, where you can still like your understanding can be at an application layer level, and you can still build solutions, right? Whereas when it comes to quantum, because it's fundamentally different. When we say fundamentally different, the basic science is different. I mean, of course, everyone here would be aware of this. Because few people have joined us new, I'm just like taking us all steps, right? So it's very important that we understand the different perspectives around quantum computing to leverage the power it offers in the real world, and that will help us build better solutions in the long term as well. Now, so when we do this, how do we try and learn, right? Because there's a lot of resources that are out there, and even research papers, YouTube videos, you take books, like these are all knowledge sources that are available to us. So how do you kind of sift through the noise and then find the right signal? That becomes very important. Otherwise, you could get kind of carried away into a rabbit hole of sorts. You could get into pseudoscience, right? A lot of pseudoscience that usually comes up when any new technology comes in, right? So it's very important that we understand the basics and from multiple perspectives. Uh, so that's on understand the need for understanding the science behind quantum, right? So that's the first. Now, why understand the policy and the art side of these things as well is because one, the technology that we are building has far more implications than just at a technology level, right? So it affects an individual, it affects a collective of individual, which we call as society. And society has been governed by state and markets for the longest period of time that we know. So understanding the boundaries in which we are operating, right? So that's what the policy angle gives to us. And of course, art comes in because in terms of storytelling, right? Of course, like we all have internet, we understand English, like there's a laptop, there's a cam, like, we understand all these things, but not everyone can get to this level itself. Because of various reasons, right? Like maybe language becomes a barrier, maybe internet connection, electricity becomes a barrier. And these are people in remote parts of India. And you'd be surprised, even in tier 2, tier 3 cities, we have such class of people, right? So how do we make sure that even the common man understands this, which we haven't really, done a lot of work in that area, but I'm saying like as a community, that's where we have to go. And that's one of the vision as well, right? So that's where art and storytelling comes into picture. How do we make sure that this technology is not being carried away by the charlatans of the world, right? How do we make sure that we own the stories that make sure that people understand the implications of what we are trying to build and what the power this gives to a common man as well, right? Of course, there's a long way to go, but at least having a vision that, hey, it's not just about the technology piece, but understanding all aspects becomes important, right? So having said that, so what are we doing to address all these different paths that we're taking? So one is the knowledge series that we conduct within Quantum Computing India. So knowledge series has two streams. One is us learning from experienced people, both on the academic side and on the practicing side. So that's where we have our Saturday events, which are essentially academics, professors, PhD students who are working in this field at a deeper level. They come and share their knowledge with us. And the second part is what we are, doing today, which is on Sundays, 4 to 6 p.m., which is peer learning. Now, how did this start and why is it important? This started because we, took in like 20 apprentices, and then like we are working along 5 different categories. One is the teaching assistant team, which is helping us put together a course, and that will help us, reach the larger set of audience that we have been talking about, right? And there, the biggest principle is, hey, how do we make this course very interesting? How do we use a meme over here? How do you use GIFs over here? Instead of being like this one-way communication, how do we make it more interactive so that people understand, right? So these are all being crafted by the teaching assistant. Now, the second category would be quantum finance. And as you all know, finance is one of the domains where quantum will be applicable in the recent times, right? Like that's the forefront of adoption in terms of technology. And there we have found a use case and we're working on that. Then the quantum cryptography team. So this entire month has been around cryptography. We started with basics of classical cryptography, implementing classical cryptographic algorithms using Python. And then third week was Dr. Urbasi from Raman Research Institute, and she took us through future of secure communications using QKD. And then
Hello, hi sir. Hi sir.
Yesterday it was Dr. Anandita from QNU Labs, and they are, I think, the first company in India to actually create a product in the market. And now we are trying to work with them as a community to build a use case as well, right? So that's on the quantum cryptography team. And then quantum machine learning. So that's what we are going to start with today. 4 to 5 is Q-means algorithm by Rajshekhar, who is part of our quantum cryptography team, quantum machine learning team. Now here, quantum machine learning, because, a logical projection into the future means that because we are having so much data, the computing power has to increase. And then like once you have more computing power, then you can find factors or find patterns that a typical computing, a classical computer may not find, okay? I mean, that's one way of thought. Then for people who are like thinking more on decentralization and why are we storing data in one place and stuff like that, there's another thing that's happening as well in the world, which is OPAL, open algorithms. Now this is developed by MIT. So where they say, instead of bringing data to the algorithms, let's take the algorithms to the data. Okay, it will still be able to do a similar level of pattern matching and recognition, and even more than that. But the point is, the data doesn't have to come to the algorithm, right? Like you don't have to have this one big ass data set and on which you're running your algorithms. Okay, so this is like two ways the world is looking at it. One is because the computing power is increasing, and like given the fact that quantum computing is kind of at reach for at least people like us to use, how do we use that to run it on a massive set of data, right? And the other side is the decentralized thing where we're like putting parts of algorithms and it goes to the data, okay, which is still in a very early stage, I would say. This is part of MIT's Building the New Economy series. You guys can read about it. You can ping me, I'll send you the links. So that's the third. So we talked about TA team, we talked about the quantum cryptography team, quantum finance team, now quantum machine learning. So quantum machine learning, now today Rajshekhar from 4 to 5, it's Q-means algorithm. And then the last team that we have is the quantum hardware team. So quantum hardware is essentially a horizontal function, right? So because everything that you're doing essentially has to go through some kind of hardware for you to implement it on any kind of quantum computer, right? So that's what we'll be talking about today, which is qubit implementation, which is from 5:30 to 6. 5 to 5:30 is quantum cryptography. So this the cryptography August will kind of come to an end, and we'll hopefully we find a use case to work on and continue working on as a team. And so today, 5 to 5:30, Mahima will take us through post-quantum cryptography, right? So it's a very nice, a bow kind of thing to whatever we have been doing this entire month. So with that as the background, the context in which we are all here, if you guys have any questions with respect to the community, how you can contribute, how you can be part of the apprenticeship program and other things, we can take now. Or it's 4:14 now. By 4:15, Rajshekhar is going to start with the session. If you have any quick questions, we can take now. And like anything else, like this has to be, I mean, the whole reason of peer learning is to learn from each other, right? So don't feel ashamed to ask questions. Like there's no such thing as dumb question in the first place. Any question is a great question. And if you have any question, like, and if you feel awkward to, unmute yourself and disturb the flow of the speaker, then you can always put it in the chat, right? So KG or anyone who knows the correct answer to that can always put it over. When is the next batch of apprentice selected? Okay, so this will happen in October. Okay, so September, so like how we have August as cryptography August, September will be machine learning, right, KG? Or finance, sorry, yeah.
Quantum finance.
Yeah, it's quantum finance. The entire September month will be quantum finance. And by October, the first set of apprentices would have gotten over, and we would have also set process in place. So when the next batch comes in, be easy for you guys to like build on. So the goal here is to build on what has been built. Like as a knowledge graph, as a community, the knowledge graph is growing, right? And the goal is to become like a search engine of sorts for any quantum related info, right? Like I said, like there's so much noise out there in the world. How do you sift through this noise and become the signal? And that's a great value that you can offer to any skill-based community that you're building. So Abhi, the short answer is October 3rd. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we also have a few students, because Abhi asked the question, from PESIT. These guys have formed their own elective, and it's very interesting to see. And I didn't realize that Indian schools were letting people do that, which is a great thing that these guys are doing. Archit and Abir have formed
one small correction, Sam says, sorry for the thing. So we are from RVC.
RV, right. RVEC, right?
Yeah, RV College of Engineering.
RVC. Right. RV College of Engineering. So they have this own module that they have designed, and they're learning quantum machine learning as a team of 15 people. And when they asked us if we can give a talk over there, and we thought this will be a better place to learn because, we started ground zero here, right? So yeah, welcome everyone, and feel free to, think of this as a session with your friend. And if you don't understand something, like, man, just stop, just explain this a little better, right? You can go down to that. You have that freedom to do that. With the facilitator series, because, these are a little more experienced people, we usually have a little more, rules and frameworks, do this, don't do that, stuff like that. Here, it's completely open. You can ask any kind of questions related to the session that's happening at any point in time. All right. Okay, great. So with that as the intro, I'm going to let Rajshekhar take over. Sorry, Rajshekhar, it has taken a little more time.
Yeah, that's fine.
All right.
Okay, thanks, Moses. Hello, everyone. My name is Rajshekhar. I have a experience in IT before, and I was a solution architect by profession. But with respect to quantum computing, I'm 3 weeks old. So started with ground zero, and I just want to share my learnings with respect to my understanding about a research paper. With that introduction, I'm going to share my screen. Please let me know if you're able to see my screen.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So for the last 2 weeks, I was looking into this paper titled Q-means, a quantum algorithm for unsupervised learning. And I'll just showcase the references from which I got this paper. So the paper is authored by these guys. You can, if you want, you can reference this. You can look at the entire paper here. I was also referencing Dancing with Qubits textbook, which actually helped me understand, some of the concepts within this Q-means algorithm. And this another QRAM. This is another paper on QRAM. Though I did not go through entirely, but found interesting, so I just pasted that as a reference here. So without any further ado, let me begin with, I'll start with, some overview about classical, k-means algorithm to begin with, and then go into the q-means algorithm. And I'll show the code and also circuit. And we'll look into some of the mathematics of this algorithm. So basically, all the machine learning algorithms begin, so the k-means algorithm basically falls into the category of unsupervised machine learning. So when we talk about unsupervised machine learning, it is predominantly that any data point within the data set, if it is not having any label, and if we want to perform certain tasks, like for instance of whatever I mentioned here, like clustering or density estimation or dimensionality reduction, such type of tasks which has input as a data without labels, we consider them under unsupervised machine learning. And in this paper, we are going to talk about q-means, and beforehand we'll look at k-means. Now the k-means algorithm, I termed it as classical k-means to distinguish between quantum computing world and classical one. The objectives of this paper is basically to introduce the q-means algorithm, and it is not necessarily that the introduction of q-means will allow improvement with respect to performance or with respect to accuracy. The main objective is how can we take the concepts from classical world into the quantum world. So we have k-means algorithm in the classical machine learning field, and how can we take that concepts into quantum computing world. By that, what are we going to achieve is not with respect to accuracy or performance, but then how can we deal with huge amount of data. So how can we do parallel computation? How can we improve the way that we compute parallelly is achieved by introduction of q-means in that quantum world. So the target is not to beat k-means. K-means is already robust. The target is how can we take it quantum route. Now to talk about k-means algorithm, I already told that it is unsupervised, and basically when we take a data set which is unlabeled data set, our objective is that the algorithm will categorize the given data into groups or clusters. Now the number of groups that a k-means algorithm can categorize, that number is something which is user defined. So user has to give an input to the algorithm that this is the number of groups that I want this data to be categorized upfront. So now since we are humans, we are looking at this piece of information on the screen, and we know that the number is 3. But then there may be data that we don't realize, and that's entirely a different again work to talk about how can we define the number. That's a separate topic altogether. But then in this case, we can say that 3 clusters is like reasonable to make, right? So from a algorithm perspective, k-means algorithm perspective, basically we'll initialize. The algorithm starts in a way that we define the k. The k is a number of clusters that we want. And then we actually initialize centroids. Centroids are considered to be centered to a particular cluster. So we initialize centroids randomly to begin with. So if you look at this graphic, you can see that the cross marks are the centroids. So the number of centroids are 3. So we define the k value, which is equal to 3, and they are initially randomly assigned. That's why you can see that all these, both these groups are single cluster to begin with. And over the period of iterations, the centroids are moving to their right points in a way that they logically make sense to form 3 different groups. So once we begin the algorithm, so we initially randomly assign the centroids. The next step is we have 2 major steps. One is a label assignment, and second one is a centroid estimation. These 2 steps, it's like a expectation maximization algorithm. We iterate over and over again until we meet a particular stopping criteria. So what are these two steps? Label assignment is nothing but you take, once you have the initial randomly assigned centroids, you compute the Euclidean distance with each of the data point with respect to that cross mark. So if in this data, let's say you have 75 data points, you take distance of each data point with each of the cross. So for every data point, we get 3 distances. Now Euclidean distance is very similar to like, the direct distance, right? You can take a root of difference of x coordinates and y coordinate squares. And then the mechanism that we apply a label assignment is telling a particular data point which cluster you belong to in this particular iteration. So how do we do that? We select the minimum distance of all the distances computed. So for a specific data point, 3 distances are computed, 3 Euclidean distances are computed for with each of these red color cross, and we take the minimum distance, and whichever cross has the whichever cross that particular data point has the minimum distance, we consider the data point falls into that particular cluster. So basically label assignment is nothing but assigning a particular data point to a particular cluster. And the next step, once all the data points are assigned to a particular cluster in the first iteration, we go to the second step of centroid estimation. What that means is, now that we have data points corresponding to each cluster, we take a mean of all those data points within each cluster and compute a new centroid for each cluster. That means we get 3 new centroids corresponding to 3 clusters formed in the previous step. That way, that cross mark, though initialized randomly, it keeps moving because the mean has changed every time in every iteration. So by the end of this step, we have new centroids, but maybe that centroids are not accurate enough. So we have to repeat these 2 steps again and again. That means we'll again calculate the Euclidean distance, compute the minimum, again calculate the new centroid, and so on. Till when do we do that? Till we meet a specific condition, stopping criteria. And here you can see the stopping criteria, which is again defined with some tau. Tau is user defined again. You can consider it as an error. What that tells us is, here T is a iteration step. So T and T minus 1 are iteration steps. So whenever the distance between the new centroid and the previous centroid, if the distance between them is less than this predefined or user defined error or tau, is when the algorithm will stop iterating with these 2 steps. That means if we set this tau as 0.2, the algorithm will iterate until the distance separation between 2 consecutive centroids in 2 consecutive iterations is less, meaning is less than or equal to that 0.2. So we have seen this classical k-means. I'll just quickly move to the next step. We know that quantum computing is not deterministic because of the random nature in the way that the quantum states and all of them are involved. So idea is, how do we make the classical k-means? Classical k-means is deterministic. We have a preset formulas, mathematical definitions with which we are able to deterministically obtain the centroids, deterministically obtain the distances. But then how do we make it more robust and make it non-deterministic or induce some sort of randomness? So they came up with something called as a delta k-means algorithm. So the delta k-means algorithm, they will try to induce some sort of noise, where delta is nothing but a user-defined number, is again it can be considered as noise to the algorithm, so that all the computations are perturbated with this particular delta. Now, what are the expectations out of this delta k-means algorithm is that we wanted to achieve similar results as that of k-means algorithm, but at the same time try to make the algorithm robust to any noise that is present. And how do we do that? Again, I'll just meaning the steps are very similar, so I'll just quickly go through all the steps. So we again have the same procedure that we have taken in the classical k-means. Initialize the K value, which is a user defined number of groups or clusters, and then initialize with random centroids, very similar to classical k-means algorithm, and then go with the two-step process again, which is again very similar. The only difference now is that here they consider that instead of deterministically picking the least distant centroid for label assignment, they'll pick the centroids from a set, and the set definition is given by this mathematical formulation, which is nothing but it is calculating distances between it knows what is the nearest centroid, and user defines a noise delta upfront, and it tries to do a tries to take a difference between the previous centroids and the new centroid which form, and whichever is less than this particular predefined noise, it forms the set with those particular centroids, and the label is assigned randomly from one of those, whatever forms a set. So there is some sort of randomness induced here. Again, the same thing applies to the centroid estimation. User defines a delta, which is again same as this. So we take a delta by 2. Here we calculate mean, like in the classical k-means. But instead of directly picking the new centroid, what we do is we again pick from a list of centroids formed by mean of the new centroid and the means obtained from the previous computation or previous iteration. And if this condition is met, it will randomly pick the new centroid from those centroids which fall under this condition. Now, if we are inducing randomness here, does that impact the performance? Yes, it would impact, but it actually depends on the delta that user defines. If the delta is huge, then the randomness is huge, and you may never converge. So the delta values that the paper has picked, the authors have picked is like around 0.2, 0.1, and 0.5, and so on. And they have come up with remarks or observations saying that the convergence of threshold is increased by delta by 2. Or in other words, what they mean is that the performance of algorithm remains very similar to the normal k-means algorithm or classical k-means algorithm whenever the deltas are small enough. If the deltas are huge, it is deviating. If the delta is small, it is performing similar to classical k-means. Why did we discuss delta k-means? Is like it is like q-means is evolving, from classical k-means through these means, right? Meaning this is the next delta k-means. So after they came up with delta k-means is when they thought finally came through how do we actually create a q-means algorithm. Now for that, we have seen the data set is a classical data set. To use the data set directly on any QML algorithm, we cannot use a classical data set. We rather have to transform the data set or the data into a way that the QML algorithms can actually take input. So there are two ways in which, based on the textbooks that I've read, there are two ways in which it can be done. One way is saying that directly give a quantum data. Again, they never explained the procedure, but the workaround is you take the classical data and put in QRAM and give it as input to the QML algorithm. So that will convert or make a QML algorithm understand or take it as a quantum data as input. So in this paper, the authors assumed that the data that is given to the Q-means algorithm is coming from QRAM data structure. So QRAM is nothing but a data structure, probably similar to a quantum register, but more information is yet to be found out. It's not clearly written in the paper, but basically they assumed that the data is, a quantum data. Now with that understanding, let's move to Q-means algorithm. So again, the expectation remains same. We are not trying to beat the performance or accuracies of k-means or delta k-means, rather, but then we want to have the Q-means algorithm resolve, large data sets. So how do they do that? By giving substantial savings from runtime perspective and handling large data sets. So Now coming to the steps involved in the Q-means algorithm, when we compare with the classical K-means or delta K-means algorithms that we discussed, the first two steps remain same, which is defining the K or Q in this case. We will define the number of clusters that the data set has to categorize into. And the next step is randomly initializing the centroids. So that steps remain same. We'll see in the code as well that centroids are randomly initialized. But unlike classical K-means and delta K-means, we have 4 different steps. In the previous case, we had only label assignment, and then we have centroid estimation. But we have 4 steps. Again, they are doing the same thing. The first 2 steps here are doing the same label assignment. So they are calculating the distance. Now to calculate the Euclidean distance, what they're trying to do is they're trying to take the superposition of the data points. Here, from the notation perspective, the VI, the small v represents the data point, where I is the index of the data point, and C is the centroid at iteration T with index J. So that is a notation. And what they're trying to do is a superposition of data point I with a particular centroid J at each and every iteration. And they're following the theorem called centroid distance estimation theorem, which does the same thing as that of the Euclidean distance in the end. And we have a circuit for this to perform this entire operation. We'll go through the circuit towards the end. But then essentially when you look at this, you can see that the I cat here is the index of the data points, and the j cat is the index of the centroids. And we are taking a tensor product, or so that, you know, and you can see the n is the number of points, data points in the data set, and root n is the weightage that is given to each of that, because we need to form the amplitudes, right? We have to do a amplitude square will give us a probability of each of those points. So this superposition or this from mathematically, this is called centroid distance estimation theorem. More details are there on in the paper, but then from circuit perspective, they're forming a superposition of data point and centroid. I'll show that when we come to the circuit part. So once we have, so by end of this step, we'll have the distances of each data point with respect to the centroids at that particular time step. And then we'll go to the cluster assignment. This is again very similar to classical K-means, picking the smallest distance or minimum distance of all the out of the 3 for example, if it's a 3 clustered data set, if k is or q is equal to 3, so there'll be 3 distances for every data point with respect to 3 different centroids. We pick the minimum distance and assign that data point to that particular cluster, which is same as classical K-means. The only thing is they're specifically defining mathematically that a quantum state, which can be represented as a weighted sum of all the labels or of each of the data points. So this is how they're defining the quantum state. And the next logical step is to, by the end of these 2 steps, we know that we have estimated the distances, and then we have assigned the labels. The next logical step is to find out the centroid and update the centroids so that we can iterate over and over again. And how does they do so for that, mathematically, we have to come up with a quantum state for each centroid at every time step. And that is possible by superposition of all the vectors in that particular cluster. So if we have 3 clusters, we take all the data points that are labeled in the previous step, and we form superposition of all of those data points in each of those clusters, and we get a new centroid for that particular cluster. So if we have 3 clusters, we will run this for 3 times. So J will run from 1 to 3 because J is the index for each centroid. For a 3 centroid scenario, J will be 1, 2, and 3. So we will compute 3 centroid states corresponding to 3 clusters. And the centroid update is again mingled with the stopping criteria. So for that, they induced 2 different error criteria. Unlike the classical k-means algorithm, they came up with 2 error conditions, and they have formulated this that the CJ-ket, again centroid for every centroid, it's a column vector, right? So they're taking a difference between the centroid, which is a complex number here in this case, with the difference between the conjugate and the centroid, and they're taking norm of it. Norm is nothing but it's you can say absolute distance between the origin and that particular vector. So basically these errors are taken in a way that the difference between the centroids that are obtained from the previous step, if they are meeting this condition, that is when this iteration will stop. So we'll see this information in code. And once we see the code, I'll now show the code. And once we see the code, we'll come back to the circuit. Let me, any questions so far? Maybe can you hear me?
Rajshekhar, no question in chat window.
Okay.
So I think you can continue.
Sir, can you please explain the centroid update function once more?
Yeah, so centroid update is basically it's obtained by the difference between each centroid computed earlier and its conjugate. If the error between the difference between them is less than the error which is predetermined or predefined, is when it will act as a stopping criteria to stop it. But then to calculate the new centroid, it is taken as a combination of these 3 errors, and they'll take the difference between iteration of the centroid of this particular state, meaning iteration, and the previous iteration. If the difference is this combination of these 3 errors, these 2 errors, and here eta is the arbitrary number that they have mentioned, which can be 1, 2, or 3, and accordingly a new centroid is updated. So that is found by a superposition of all the vectors in each cluster. So you have to take the I index. I is the index of the data points. You take the superposition of all the data points in each cluster formulated, and then you'll get the centroid for that. But this error criteria specifically is used when you bring, see basically from circuit perspective, what I understood is that you'll take Hadamard gate to actually compute the superposition, meaning the centroid, and you have to take the outcomes into a classical register to bring it to classical computation, because we have to meet this stopping criteria. So every time what they're doing is they're bringing it is a iterative loop wherein they'll calculate the new centroids using the circuit, and they'll bring it to classical registers. And from classical registers, they are actually, meaning once they bring it to classical register, it will measure. Once they measure, then it will come to our code, and in the code we will have steps where I'll show you where these error criteria are seen whether they're met or not. And if it is not met, it will go back to the previous steps, calculate distance again, formulate new centroid, and get us the new centroid to the classical register again, and then look at these error values and go back and do that again and again, is what is happening.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, you're welcome. So I'll just bring the code, and may I know if you're able to see the screen?
Yes, sir. I'm seeing Rajshekhar.
Okay. So here,
Rajshekhar, there is a suggestion to scroll slowly.
oh, scroll so slowly. Okay, sure. So here you can see that we are using pandas to import a CSV file. So basically in the CSV file, what we have is 3 columns with all the data. We have a 75 rows of data. That means we have 75 data points to formulate into 3 different clusters. So you can see how the data looks like here. So they're considering the first as feature 1 and first column as feature 1 and second one as feature 2. And these are the classes. Here you can, since we are doing only head, we can see green, but otherwise we have 3 classes, 3 different colors, and 75 rows. So that means 75 different exemplars or data points we can call. And as we scroll down, we'll see that they're trying to, you know, change the categorical data of class, and then convert it to codes, and then use the first 2 columns as the data and the last column as the category, which makes sense because we want the data points to be data and the class to be as a cluster. So, and in this example, they have taken the number of clusters, which is like I said, it's user defined, k equal to 3. And what they did was they computed centroids randomly. How did they do that? Again, if you just do a random initialization, your centroids may be lying somewhere. So they initially calculate the mean and standard deviation of the given data so that the centroids fall randomly in that nearby locations within the data. There's a graph to show that. So here you can see basically after this, we have just plotted it after randomly initializing. If I scroll down, you can see initially you can see the data points are colored in advance to represent their clusters. So black color is one cluster, blue is another, green is the third one. But you can see the centroids are randomly initialized not in the right positions but somewhere else. But in the positions which are very nearby to the data set, because we have taken mean and standard deviation of the data to randomly initialize this. And then they came up with a method function where it will calculate the distances. Here what is happening is maybe I have to reduce a little bit. Okay, is it visible?
I think with this.
If I'm zooming, this is getting truncated. So
this is working.
This is visible.
Okay. So here they have taken phi list and theta list. I'll talk about U3 gate. Here in the implementation, they are using U3 gate. I have detailed information about that, but we'll see what they're taking. So they're taking phi list and theta list. And what are the values that they're taking phi list and theta list is they're considering the 3 centroids and the data points. And you can see the phi is having associated with feature 1 of the data. We have the first column of the data set, and this where theta is initialized with or it is iterating with this data. This is the second feature of the data, and with respect to centroids as well. They're taking quantum registers, initializing with 3 quantum registers and 1 classical register. And you can see that the simulator is initialized. Air is a simulator. It is initialized, and in the code, what is happening is whatever is coming from quantum register, what we are getting is the data points, and that data points are passed into the U3 gate. And this U3 gate, as you can see, we will take 3 values, which is a theta, phi, and this is a lambda actually. Lambda is given as 0. We'll see what lambda is again when we reach there. And with the data inputs, with the data values present in quantum registers. And after processing through U3 gates, it is given to swap, because swap is used because you have to transfer data from the quantum register so that to the ancillary register so that you can measure. Otherwise, the data will be disturbed if it is not copied to ancillary bits. And then you apply a Hadamard gate. Why Hadamard gate is applied is because this is create the superposition between the data point and the centroid. It is like the Euclidean distance formula. That computation is calculated. Whatever I shown. Let me go back. The centroid distance estimation theorem, whatever I explained here, this is actually obtained by passing through the Hadamard gate here. And then the ancillaries are measured and it is sent to the classical register. Once it is sent to classical register, we'll go back and check for the error conditions that we talked about. How we talked about taking a norm of difference between the new centroids and old centroids, and until here they took the error as 0.02. So until the error is met, it keeps iterating over and over. We are calling the above defined function here. This is the function that we were explaining with the circuit there. So the distances are obtained from the function, and based on the distances obtained, the minimum distance is taken and a cluster assignment happens for each data point. And then based on the error conditions, the stopping criteria, it will stop. It will come out. And the end result is that we get the actual, reasonable centroids for the data set. To understand this, actually, we need to understand the function that is happening within the gates, how the distance calculation is happening through U3 gate, and how the CSWAP and the Hadamard gate are helping us to formulate that centroid distance estimation theorem formulation, mathematical formulation. For that, there is explanation about the circuit here. We can see that there are 9 qubits here, and the first 3 qubits is data repetitively sent to U3 gates, and their corresponding centroids are stored in another 3 qubits. And this cross is nothing but a swap. And the first Hadamard gate, the output of these U3 gates is given to the is given to the Hadamard gate. So here it is a 2-dimensional, but it has to become a 4-dimensional here. We'll see how it will become. Let me explain about the U3 gate first, and then I'll explain about how the Hadamard gate has to be converted with the tensor product into a higher dimensional matrix mathematically, so that when 2 wires are getting, when a gate is getting 2 inputs, how can it treat, right? So for that, we'll talk about U3 gate. Now U3 gate is called a universal quantum gate, version 3, it's 3, it's named 3. Now when we consider any quantum state, the wave function, we will see that a quantum state can be represented with A ket and a B, A0 ket plus a B1 ket. Now what does this mean is that we have it's forming a superposition of 0 and 1. That's how we are representing quantum state. And we know that with the normalization condition, because if this has to be if this wave function needs to be a probability density function, it has to meet the normalization condition, which means it has to be meeting this condition of psi square equal to a square plus b square, because which should be equal to 1, because the amplitudes here A and B, the square of the amplitudes will give the probability, and the probability of getting 0 and the probability of getting 1, if we add, it should be 1. So we know that this has to meet. And when this is meeting, we know that we can represent it as inner product. Here psi, and we can represent it in a bracket notation, which is equal to nothing but psi square, which is nothing but psi multiplied with psi dagger. Psi dagger is nothing but transverse conjugate of psi. why we are discussing this is because we are trying to formulate a U3 gate. We begin with a quantum state, which is meeting a normalization condition. And we take a Euler's formula. From Euler's formula, we know that e power any theta I or phi I is equal to cos phi plus I sin phi. We studied in high school. What they're trying to tell is that any quantum state, its absolute value remains same even if you multiply with e power phi I, because the absolute value of e power phi I is nothing but the absolute value of cos phi plus I sin phi, which is nothing but root of cos phi square plus I sin phi square, which is nothing but 1. So essentially, the quantum state psi is nothing but e power I psi, meaning e power I psi multiplied with the same quantum state. So what this means is the value of the quantum state, absolute value remains same. The only thing that changes is the phase. So irrespective of phase changes, the absolute values remains same. Now they term this as a global phase because the phi here represent the phi change in the Bloch sphere, and they consider that change in phi doesn't impact the absolute value of the psi. To showcase that in Bloch sphere, we have to translate our quantum state into polar form, and this can be translated into polar form in this format R1 e power. Now you can look at carefully that we are representing e power phi I with phi 1 I, because this is one separate thing than this, right? Meaning that's why we have a separate phi's. So we have phi 1 here and phi 2 here. If you divide this by phi 1 e power phi I or e power phi 1, you will get R1 ket 0 plus R2 ket 1 into e power phi 2 minus phi 1. Now phi 2 minus phi 1 they consider as phi. They simplified this into this notation. And we know that again the absolute value of this will remain same, right? So again the amplitude should meet our original normalization condition. So that means R1 square plus R2 square should be equal to 1. And we know that when we want to meet this, we can induce some from trigonometry that cos theta by 2 or sin theta by 2, cos square plus sin square will be equal to 1. So we can rephrase this quantum state with this formulation of theta and phi. Why all of this is done is because if you look at a Bloch sphere, we'll see that in this case we are considering a 3-dimensional Bloch sphere where you have x, y, and z, and you'll see that the quantum state psi can be represented as a function of in a polar form with respect to theta, and here theta is with respect to z. So it actually varies from pos to z. So it will be 0 to pi in the upper hemisphere here. And at the bottom, you will see the psi, which is with respect to x. So it will go from 0 to 2 pi, 360 degrees. So a quantum state can be represented in a Bloch sphere with respect to change in z directions with theta representation and psi in the x direction. And essentially, this is how you can represent in a polar, in the quantum state in a polar form. So by taking this, you can actually derive the U3 gate formulation. Now, if you go back to quantum mechanics, always we see that the position of electron and the position or the momentum of electron is determined from the position of electron by applying some sort of operator. And the operator is nothing but the gate. The operator in physics, in quantum mechanics, is nothing but a gate in quantum computation that we are looking at. So basically, operators are applied on wave functions in quantum mechanics or quantum physics. And here we are applying gate on a particular input of qubit. So that means the gate in here is nothing but operator there. So we need to find a particular operator that is applied on a particular qubit to get a wave function or a quantum state. Basically, any gate that you apply on a qubit, you get a quantum state. So if you replace this 0 ket with a matrix notation, we know that it is in matrix form, it is 1 and 0 like this in column vector. And the state, the quantum state is given by, cause we already have seen this in polar form. We replace that with this equation. We just took what operator or what gate when applied on 0 ket will give us a quantum state. So we have to find out that u. What is that gate that we can apply on 0 ket and get this? To do that, we just replaced 0 ket with column vector and quantum state with the quantum state we obtained in polar form. When we get that, we can see that the one u that can fit this formulation is this particular matrix. To check whether this fits or not, you can multiply this matrix with 1, the column vector 1, 0. You will get the quantum state. Because if there is 0, this a and b will go. A and b are nothing but some complex numbers. Any complex numbers you can replace here. But it doesn't matter. Whatever you place here with this multiplication, they will go and you'll get the quantum state. Now, any gate has to meet one fundamental idea, that is nothing but any gate should be unitary. When we say unitary, what that does mean, that means is the matrix of that particular gate, any gate that could be, it can be called as a gate when you multiply that gate matrix with its gate dagger, that matrix dagger. What does dagger mean? Is complex, conjugate, and also transpose. You take a transpose and you take a conjugate of that transpose, then you get a u dagger or dagger of that matrix. So when you multiply a gate matrix with its dagger matrix, you should get identity matrix. If that condition is met, only then you can call it as a gate. So that is a basic property. And from high school mathematics, we know that any matrix multiplied with its inverse, we will get identity. So then if these two are true, then these two should also be equal. In this case, we can see the inverse can be equal to the u dagger. So he has taken, this is from the textbook Sutar, Dancing with Qubits actually. You can see that the u matrix, you take the inverse of it and you equate to the u dagger, which is nothing but you take transpose of this matrix and then calculate the conjugate. If you equate them, you will get the values of a and b. And if you, those values, if you replace here, you will get the u3 gate formulation. This is the u3 gate. Why I explained all this is because this is the gate that they are using in the Q-means algorithm. And the importance of this gate is that this gate is a universal gate. When we say universal gate, what it means is that in a classical computing, you know that you can achieve any output from universal gates. For example, you can use and not. By using AND gate, a classical AND gate and a classical NOT gate, a combination of those two can give us any combination of the output any combination of desired output. So such gates can be termed as universal gates. So here also we have 3 parameter U3 gate. Parameters include theta, phi, and lambda. A U3 gate. Any combination of these 3 parameters can give us any desired type of output. So that's why it's called universal gate. And that is one thing. And if you see the circuit, the qubits are given as input to the U3 gate and you get the output, and the output is sent to the Hadamard gate. Now for Hadamard gate, you know that Hadamard gate is a single qubit gate. Unlike CNOT gate, CNOT gate is a 2 input qubit gate. Here you can see swap also. Swap is having 2 inputs. It's a 2 input gate. That's why you have a matrix of 4 by 4. But Hadamard gate is a single qubit input gate, and we have this matrix formulation for Hadamard gate. Then how do we take 2 inputs? Because we can see from here 2 wires are combining and giving an input to the Hadamard gate. How can 2 different qubits can combine and go into a Hadamard gate, mathematically, how is it possible is like you take a Hadamard gate, which is nothing but this matrix, and you do a tensor product with a matrix, identity matrix, 2 cross 2, and that will become a 4 cross 4 matrix. How does this become this way? You have to go through this tensor product. Basically, tensor product is nothing but you take a 1 here, multiply with 1 0, you get this 1 0, and you take the next one, you multiply with 1 0, you get 1 0 here again, and likewise you keep multiplying. You take 1 again here. Basically, you take 1 and multiply this entire matrix, you get this matrix, and you take this one, you multiply this matrix, you get this matrix. You take this one, multiply with 0, you get this matrix, this. And to take -1, multiply with this matrix, you will get -1, 0, and -1. So that's a tensor product. How does the tensor product help? Because we have to balance it out, right, from circuit and how we are getting mathematics. Because until at the end of the day, we have to get mathematically the result which we have seen from the algorithm. So mathematically, if two wires are getting qubits to a single gate, we'll see that this tensor product is giving us a 4 cross 4 matrix, which can be multiplied with swap later. So all this 4 cross 4 matrix will get multiplied and we'll get result. And that will be measured when transferred to a classical register, basically. So basically the measurements are later sent to classical registers. And those classical register output is what we have seen in the program that they used to determine, check the error condition that we talked about in the centroid update place, and then determine whether it has to stop or it has to go again back to the distance calculation. If it has to go again back to distance calculation, it will once again go to U3 gate and do it again and again. In the end, repeated experiments that they have done with the various different delta values. Now delta is nothing but you have seen delta here. Lambda is equal to delta minus phi, and you also have k-means or delta k-means. You can see that the radical or dark one is a classical k-means. From accuracy perspective, classical k-means is performing better than others, and which is expected, right? Because ultimately we are not trying to beat the accuracy, but trying to address the situation with a large amount of data with parallel execution. And there is more to connect between the mathematics and the circuit with appropriate matrix. I'm still working on figuring out how this combinations work, because ultimately, this is my understanding so far about this paper. So any questions you have? Actually, I'm pretty much done with what I understood so far. Oh, there are so many questions I didn't see. Okay, this on which factors it depends. Okay, this answer is 9. There is a formula to determine number of qubits, which is 3 into number of clusters. So I don't know from where I can point out that formula, but there is a formula to determine. So it depends on number of clusters actually. So for 3 clusters, it should be 9 for to answer this question. Yes, definitely. Provide notes. I think this video will be shared. And for references, you can check the references mentioned here. The U3 gate proof and explanation is detailed given in Dancing with Qubits. The algorithms and theorems are mentioned in this paper if you want to look at mathematically. Yeah, Jupyter Notebook I can provide. Okay, I think 3 features instead of 2. How would you encode that, and how many qubits would that require? So that is equal to there's a formula saying that. So there's a formula saying that 3 into number of clusters into ceiling of number of features by 2. So using this formula, you can determine if the number of features increase, you have to increase the number of qubits. If the number of clusters also increase, you have to increase the qubits. That's the answer for this question. And what Hadamard gate does to enable the superposition properties in qubit? Oh well, so you when you go back to this Hadamard gate, what it does. So when you look at this matrix, right? So basically, if you, I don't know how to, I don't have a writer. So when you take a bracket notation, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'll probably answer this. Actually, the only question is what Hadamard gate does to enable superposition properties in qubit. So it takes
I will take Rajshekhar.
Sure.
Okay, so usually the Hadamard gate 1 by square root of 2 multiplied by 1 minus 1. That will make your current data point to the superposition from which you can perform the U3 or any quantum gate operation. That's the reason why we have to set or we have to move any data to the Hadamard gate. Then we have to perform the quantum gate operation U3. That's the reason why in this case we are using H gate then U3 gates. So the Hadamard gates will make the data points 1 by square root of 1 divided by square root of 2 multiplied by the respective matrix. So that is one of the prerequisites for performing U3. That is answer your question, which? Yeah. Okay. Please go ahead, Rashid.
That's all, KG. I'm pretty much done actually.
I think we are done. Sam, if no more question, we can hand over to next team.
All right. Thanks a lot, Rajshekhar.